Welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery programming series for our current show, Sequence, curated by Christine DePiro Abbott. Today, we are thrilled to present the artist, Leigh Garcia. As a brief reminder, everyone tuning in today is in listen-only mode. Feel free to utilize that chat function to ask questions, and we'll be sure to get to them at the end of the talk. Also, please keep in mind that because we're presenting from separate locations, there may be some variation of bandwidth, so if one of us freezes up or the sound fluctuates, thanks in advance for bearing with us. All right, welcome, Leigh.
Thanks, Kat. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Leigh Garcia. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an artist born and raised in Dallas, Texas. So I currently live in Kent, Ohio, where I work in my home studio that you can see here. For the last 5 years, I've been a professor of print media and photography at Kent State, and I recently accepted a position as a printmaking professor at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. So I'll be moving here pretty soon. But like I said, I'm originally from Dallas, Texas. And aside from identifying as an artist and professor, I also identify as a biracial Latina. So for me, what that means is that on my mom's side, I'm a seventh generation Texan of European descent. So I come from a really long line of very kind of stereotypical white cattle farmers. And then on my dad's side, I'm a second generation Mexican American. My grandfather crossed the Rio Grande to get to the United States in the 1940s, and he did this through undocumented immigration. So because I've grown up between these two cultures, races, and ethnicities, I've always been very hyper aware of race and the differences in how the two sides of my families are treated. Also growing up in Texas, this was contextualized by my experiences with the long, complicated history of Texas and Mexico. So as many of y'all know, Texas used to be a part of Mexico. Before Mexico, it was, of course, indigenous land. So politically, socially, racially, culturally, there's just a lot to uncover, and that's primarily what my artwork is about. Not just my experience between these two races and cultures, but also the historic relationship between white Texans and indigenous Mexicans and the residual racial discord that occurs today because of it. And of course, a topic at the forefront of all of this is undocumented immigration. So some of you may be aware that Border Patrol agents have adopted a practice of dragging this tire contraption along the border wall. And this is not something that the Border Patrol as an agency has put together. This is something that specific Border Patrol agents take their own time to make and with their own resources. But essentially what this does is it combs the sand or the earth along the border wall so that it's easier to find footprints and therefore track down undocumented people. And this vigilante mentality of going out of their way to track down immigrants is deeply disturbing to me. So in this screen print, let me move this a little bit. In this screen print, vigilantes, there we go. You can see in the sand, there are soldaderas or women of the Mexican Revolution. There are vaqueros or Mexican cowboys, and also pre-Columbian indigenous Mexicans, specifically Tlaxcalans. That's the indigenous Mexican people that I am a descendant of. So I was just thinking about how my Native ancestors might feel about contemporary Border Patrol practices. This past July in 2023, as part of Texas Governor Greg Abbott's Operation Lone Star, he placed this floating border wall in the Rio Grande. So this is made of plastic buoys and saw blades. It's about 1,000 feet long. It's between Eagle Pass, Texas, and Piedras Negras, Mexico. And a federal judge recently ruled it unconstitutional, but Abbott is appealing the decision, stating something along the lines of Texas is like exercising its self-defense against the invasion of unauthorized immigrants. So this is a diptych piece to vigilantes titled Operation Lone Star, where again, you can see my Mexican ancestors seemingly attacking this contemporary Border Patrol practice. Unfortunately, those who do make it safely across the border often become trapped in industries that take advantage of their immigration status. A 2017 study by the United Fresh Produce Association estimated that 50 to 70% of all farm workers are undocumented in the United States. And that's a pretty wide range, 50 to 70%, which of course is because it's hard to do research on undocumented people. But a lot of them end up picking strawberries, which is a really physically demanding crop to pick. You know, it grows really low to the ground, so they're kneeling, bending for extended amounts of time. And because they're undocumented, they have very little power to resist unfair wages. They often lack decent housing, job security, representation, and they can even become victims of labor trafficking. There are a few protections for undocumented immigrants in the United States, one of them being DACA, or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which was a policy put into effect by the Obama administration in 2012. So many DACA recipients or dreamers have adopted the monarch butterfly as a symbol for their, their status. And that's of course because monarchs are an insect that travels or migrates between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, regardless of how tall a border wall is. So in Catching Flies, I was imagining US anti-immigration policies as a fly magnet. So you can see very little text on the fly magnet, and those are the policy titles. And as you can see, it's catching nothing but beautiful monarchs that are just trying to migrate from the north and south. Water jugs are a symbol that I use a lot in my work because immigrants often travel with them when they're crossing the border, and then they end up discarding them on their journey. So these are actually some photos that I took in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. This was in the Santa Ana Wildlife Refuge in South Texas. And because of this, I think of water jugs almost like breadcrumbs, like they're being left behind for future immigrants to follow. And you'll hear a little bit of audio here. So this was an installation that I did at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I had these ceramic vessels that I thought of in context with the jugs as kind of holding our histories. So in each jug, there was a representation of a moment in Mexican Texas history that has led to what I consider to be an economic refugee crisis of undocumented people. In this piece, Mas que hoy, I consider how undocumented immigration is only a tiny fraction of Mexican history. I think a lot of Mexican Mexican Americans, we kind of think of undocumented immigration as this overarching huge issue, which it is, but it can kind of cloud the larger sense of our history, which can be traced back 10,000 years before the first European settlers. So here I was kind of trying to contextualize that visually. So you can see there's a pre-Hispanic mask of life and death at the bottom. Spanish colonization is kind of represented through Catholicism, through the Virgin. And then we have corn stalks on the side, which has always been a constant for 10,000 years. A monarch butterfly, and at the very, very top sliver, there's a little Border Patrol wall and truck. Water jugs can also be thought of as a symbol of hope because they can quite literally mean the difference between life and death in the desert. So in this piece, I was thinking of them in a more hopeful way using a kind of traditional embroidery there. So while making this water jug work, I've had a lot of people ask me, is this a milk jug? Or they have other connotations attached to the jug, which made me think about how our cultural context, our experiences, and our level of understanding of undocumented immigration can really impact how we read this symbol. And so in Bivouac, I kind of took that on and created the jug in many different forms. So there are some jugs that do represent milk jugs. Some I was thinking about that might be, left in the earth and kind of decomposing. So they turn into kind of like plants. And then I covered the whole structure with relief printed monarch butterflies, which again is a symbol for Mexican immigration. And the whole sculpture kind of takes on the form of a bivouac, which is that cluster of monarchs that they naturally do as they reach their destination. And I know Cleveland on Lake Erie is actually a location where you can find bivouacs of monarchs. So along with all of this printmaking and paper making and sculpture work that you've seen, I also engage in a socially engaged practice. And I do this largely in collaboration with my art partner, Maria Amalia Wood. So Maria and I met in grad school. We were both in a papermaking class together. We were also two of the only Latinas in the entire program, so we really kind of hit it off. Just do it quiet here. And Maria had been living in Madison, Wisconsin for a long time. She was really integrated in the Latino community there. And we decided we wanted to do a project together where we would interview and celebrate undocumented women that were in Madison, Wisconsin. So we began by interviewing them. We basically invited ourselves into their homes and they would tell us their life stories. And then we made handmade paper based on their stories. And so Maria is more of an abstract artist. She created these kind of color field maps to map out the women's stories. I was really interested in some of the objects that they would mention. And so I took those objects, drew them, and translated them into screen print, which you can see here. I'm screen printing onto the handmade paper. And then we went back and embedded those into handmade paper. And then once the handmade paper was dry, we went back in and added quotes from the women's stories. We added drawings and other embellishments. And then we had a big celebratory event for the women. We just felt like, we had invited ourselves into their spaces. We wanted to invite them into ours, which at the time was the art building at UW-Madison. So we kind of rented out the space and we had it catered. We had music. We had a photographer to take photos of the women and their families together, because family was something that was really important that many of them brought up in their interviews. Maria embroidered the napkins that we used with their quotes, and we talked to them about thinking of stains as a metaphor for undocumented immigration, because it's something that can be seen as dirty and bad, but can also be really beautiful. And so you'll see some of them got really into it. They're painting them by the end. And then because we made handmade paper with printmaking, we were able to make multiples of each piece and give them back to the families. We also had this paper making activity so that they could kind of better understand our process. Okay, so that was just a really exciting project for me personally, one of my more favorite things that I've been able to do as an artist. And we just felt like, the works on paper were really exciting to make, but being able to celebrate the women and kind of give power back to them and tell them that their stories of undocumented immigration are beautiful was really kind of what that project was about. And we were really excited. The series of prints on paper was purchased by the University of Wisconsin's health system a couple years ago. And so it's actually out in one of their hospitals in Madison, Wisconsin now, which is pretty cool. So after that project, Maria and I went to Mexico together. We traveled and wanted to learn more about indigenous paper making processes. So here we are in Etla, which is a small town outside of Oaxaca, Mexico, where we were introduced to amate paper making. And so amate, as you can see, is where you're taking the bark of a ficus tree, and then you use a rock to pound the fibers together into sheet formation. And here it is drying outside. So we came back to the States and we were really excited about amate, and we knew we wanted to do some kind of project involving it. So we created the project Resiliencia, where something Maria and I talked about a lot was how you can get on the internet and so easily find these horrible, hateful comments about undocumented people and really about Latinos in general. So we did some horrible research, spent a couple hours getting these disgusting comments off of YouTube, and we printed them out on handmade paper. We tore them into strips, and then we asked the public to help us pound them into amate. And so it's been a really fun project. It's kind of therapeutic. You know, you give these horrible comments to a group of people and they pick the one that kind of like makes them the most pissed off. And then you get to spend, 10 minutes like beating it with a rock. So we've found that it's fostered a lot of fun conversations, and we've done this a couple times now. The first being at the Overture Center, which is like a gallery in Madison, Wisconsin. We've also done it at Kent State. This is with SALSA, the Spanish and Latino Student Association. We did this at Lighthouse Church in Madison, Wisconsin, which is the same church where most of the women from our previous project go to church together, and Maria had met them. Madison Senior Center in Madison, so it's a predominantly Latino senior center, and then recently with interior design students at Kent State. So I've been making this work about undocumented immigration for some time now, and while making it, I feel like my privilege has become more and more apparent because my grandparents were undocumented immigrants, and I consider myself to be a byproduct of that phenomenon, but I am still a documented citizen of the United States myself. I'm also half white, I speak English, I'm a university professor, so I'm educated. And so I'm kind of shifting gears in my practice and trying to think a little bit more about my identity as a biracial, multiracial person in conversation with undocumented immigration. So just a little bit about biracial and multiracial populations. Biracial, multiracial, of course, is meaning more than one race. And it's important to note that that's different from being multi-ethnic or multicultural. Race is a social construct, and it's largely based off of phenotypical identifiers. So like, your hair color, eye color, as well as cultural bases like ideology and language. We can also think of race as a process, so racialization, and which would be the process of assigning labels and stigmas to groups of people. And within the United States, the United Census Bureau plays a huge role in how we assign racial categories. But I think it's really important to note that these racial categories are always changing. So for example, in 1930, Mexican was actually its own race, which obviously is not anymore. And in 2000, for the very first time ever, the United Census Bureau allowed residents to check more than one box and therefore identify as multiracial. So while making this more, recent work about being biracial, my sister Meg has been really influential. She is my full sibling, so we're biracial in the same biological combination. And we have a lot of conversations about being biracial because she actually wrote her dissertation on biracial identity development. She's a mental health counselor. So in this lino cut, I show Meg and I kind of navigating between an assortment of Mexican and white Texan cultural signifiers. And you can see we're in this kind of like theatrical, almost acrobatic balance. And in the background is a really subtle line that shows the border between Texas and Mexico. Here, I also depict my sister and I between our two cultures. So this is El Árbol del Strife, which was influenced by the Mexican Tree of Life ceramics. So these are very traditional ceramics you'll see in Mexico. They were used in the 16th century to evangelize Christianity to indigenous Mexicans. And they oftentimes portray creation stories from the Bible. But in here, I think about the creation of my sister, Meg, and I. So I put these historical figures, both shameful and celebrated from both sides of our families. And in this direct juxtaposition, I'm just highlighting that really stark contrast between phenotypes, clothing, social, political affiliations of both sides of our families. One time, Meg and I were talking about our biracial identity, and Meg was like, oh, it's almost like we can say we conquered us. And I thought that was really smart. So I stole that idea for this print. So in How We Conquered Us, I'm again playing on the conflicting emotions and kind of that sense of allegiance that many biracial people experience when we're thinking about our past. So specifically for me, that would be the conquest of my paternal Mexican family at the hands of my maternal European family throughout Texas history. So here you can see I used self-portraiture. I was kind of inserting myself in these historical moments. So you can see I've got like the Battle of the Alamo represented and some Spanish colonizers represented. using hats to kind of identify these historical moments. And from the permanent collection, I'm considering my nose and my profile. So that's something that I've always thought was kind of unique to myself. My nose is not something that I've seen in a lot of my family members. And I always wonder, like, did that come from my white European side? Did it come from my Mexican indigenous side? So I did some research and found some artifacts representing a bunch of different cultures that I have within me, and then kind of compared them here. Growing up, one of probably the most biracial experiences I can recall is merienda. So merienda is like a term for kind of like Mexican tea in the afternoon. Like you have your coffee, you have your sweetbread or pan dulce. So this is something I grew up, we would do like every Saturday around 4 o'clock. But because I'm also half white, we would eat them on these like traditional European blue plates. And so we're eating these conchas, Mexican sweetbread, on a European plate. And just a little bit about the process in this piece. So the center piece, the concha or pan dulce, is actually a cast paper making piece. So I have just a little video here to show you that process. So I took an actual concha and I casted it in plaster and then cleaned that out and replaced it with paper pulp so that you have a cast piece. Another distinct biracial experience for me was being one of the only people of color in a white Lutheran church. So here I'm depicting my baptism at the hands of a white pastor. And then in the water, you can see that's my grandfather swimming across the Rio Grande. So I was kind of thinking of his swimming across the Rio Grande and immigration as like a symbolic baptism into a new life, and juxtaposing that with my literal baptism. And I've been continuing this strategy of comparing and contrasting my experiences as a privileged, second generation, half white citizen of the United States with the experiences of some of my family members. And you'll see I'm kind of integrating handmade paper more and more in my practice. So in this piece, Texas 1015, that is named after the onion, the Texas 1015 onion. And the reason it's called that is because its planting date is October 15th. But this is a vegetable that my dad is really familiar with because he grew up picking onions and sacking them in South Texas. So you'll see there's like an image of him down here sacking the onions. And then juxtaposing that with my experience with the onion, which is just like buying it at the store and cutting it up. And even for me, that's like a lot of work. So comparing those here. And again, a little bit about the process. So the background is actual onions. It's an onion papyrus, so actual onion skins that have been like kind of laminated together. In this piece, My Sister's Tortillas, I'm comparing the experiences of my sister Meg and I with our grandmother Peta and her sister Carmen. So my grandmother and her sisters grew up in Monterrey, Mexico, and they would make their tortillas from scratch. So they're like buying corn, grinding it with a metate to make masa, and then like hand forming the tortillas to cook them on a comal. So very like labor intensive. And then just 2 generations later, my sister and I, we go to the store and we buy crappy tortillas that we, buy in plastic bags. So even though we're not engaging in the same labor intensive process as my grandmother and her sisters did when making tortillas, it's something that my sister and I still bond over. Like during the pandemic, she actually lived with my husband and I for 9 months. And during that time, we just made tons of tortilla-based meals together. Again, those like crappy store-bought tortillas, but still some time we spent together in the kitchen. And this piece was actually digitally printed into a mural in downtown Cleveland. So I guess there's a chance some of you may have seen it if you live in Cleveland. This was in Public Square. This is some process video of my most recent piece, El Albañil. So that means the tile worker or tile setter. So here I am using handmade paper to make tiles, and then I'm using thin set and other like traditional tile making materials to do a portrait of my grandfather, who was a tile worker. So this piece was recently shown at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Cleveland. And I've just been thinking a lot about my grandfather's practice as a tile worker and then my practice as an artist and kind of comparing and contrasting those. Here it is again. Yeah, I think about how my grandfather, his life was so different from mine. You know, he was an undocumented person, didn't speak English much, had like a fifth grade education, but he spent every day using his hands to make things and using a pencil and a ruler. And these are all things that I do every day as well, though in a much more privileged sense, you know, as an artist. So I'm currently working on a body of work about him and his tile working, and it's going to be in a solo show at the Canton Art Museum in a couple of months. But yeah, I've been using handmade paper to kind of explore this, as well as intaglio printmaking. So here's me working on some intaglio prints of traditional Talavera tiles, and then kind of, you know, collaging those together. And that's where I'm at in my practice right now. So yeah, I think we've got time for questions if anyone has them, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Leigh. So I'm curious, how did you start in printmaking? How did you get into the arts and printmaking? And then when was the nexus? When did the kind of uh, deep inroad of social justice and personal narrative of a biracial experience come into play?
Yeah, that's a great question because printmaking is like such a specific niche art form that a lot of people don't know, you know, don't know what it is. Even a lot of my family members, I tell them I'm a professor of printmaking, and they're like, okay, whatever. But yeah, I was really fortunate to go to an arts magnet high school in downtown Dallas called Booker T. Washington. So I had no idea what printmaking was. You know, I was not, my parents aren't artists. I was nothing like that. But when it came time to go to high school, there was an arts magnet. I applied and got in. And then it was like my sophomore or junior year that I was introduced to printmaking. And my teacher, Ms. Kuchide, she was amazing. She was really passionate about the Free Tibet movement. And so everything in her teaching kind of came from this social justice standpoint, which is really important to printmaking because of printmaking's historical connotation with political and social movements. So she would often tell us, like, you know, this is the process, this is printmaking and lino cut and relief or whatever, but this is how it's been used in the real world to make impact. Like here it is in the Mexican Revolution being used as wheat pasted imagery to like make social change. So I think because of her, I've always kind of understood that you can use printmaking and its inherent ability to make multiples as a way of like not only making artwork, but also trying to make social influence or making, you know, statements and bringing up social justice issues. So yeah, and then for me, you know, social justice issues has always been centered. I've been more passionate about undocumented immigration just because of my familial connection with that. And yeah, I think it wasn't until I moved out of Texas that I really started making work about undocumented immigration and my Mexican heritage. Being in Texas, you know, it's not uncommon to be Mexican or to be even biracial, to be half white and Mexican, just because those are the populations that are there. But when I moved to Madison, Wisconsin for grad school, it was kind of this culture shock of like, oh my gosh, I'm the only person of color in the room, or like I'm the only brown person in my friend group. And so that really highlighted that for me, and is when I started making this kind of work. And it also just happened to be in 2016 when, of course, the Trump election was, you know, talking about undocumented immigration, and that was like at the forefront of the news. So yeah, that's when that started.
Great. So clearly family ties are really deep and important for you. Can you share if you have a favorite childhood memory of your grandfather?
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's funny because my relationship with my grandfather, we weren't super close. Like he lived mostly in Monterrey and I was in Dallas, so I wouldn't see him too often. And then like bigger than that, there was a language barrier. So I speak very little Spanish. He spoke very little English. So our relationship, you know, it wasn't there was not a lot of communication there. But I do remember for spring break, we would go visit him in Monterrey a lot. And actually, he lived in a small town outside of Monterrey called Atongo, very, very small town, and had a really cute little ranch there. He like built the house there for he and my grandmother. He did all the tile work inside the house, of course, because he was a tile worker. So I think my favorite memories of him were just the things that he made, really. And he died about 7 years ago now. And it was last summer that my family and I went back to his ranch in Monterrey for the first time in maybe like a decade, maybe even more. And it was really cool to see the house and the tile work that he had made with like my new kind of artist lens, because I think the last time I had been there was before I was into art. I was like maybe in middle school. So being an artist now, I think I saw the house and the tile work and I appreciated it in a much different way of like, wow, um, these are like aesthetic, artistic decisions that he was making with his like fifth grade education and no arts education. And it was really beautiful.
So clearly social justice and the issues around undocumented immigration are really key within your work and provide quite a lot of inspiration. I'm curious, what other components of inspiration do you draw upon in order to make your work? Are there other artists or other processes or anything that you really draw from when you are creating your work?
Yeah, I mean, so much. And it's funny because I think in the arts, especially from like an academic standpoint, I just went through the tenure process and it's like, what is your research as an art professor? And research for an artist can mean like so many different things. For me, just visiting my family in Monterrey, that's like research for me. That's like so invigorating and inspiring for my practice. But yeah, I think I went to Mexico. I've been going a lot more recently because I've found that it's just like really influential to my work. And not only the artwork that's being made down there right now, there's like beautiful Mexican prints that are being made in like a contemporary sense, but also like historical printmaking in Mexico is really exciting. I mentioned the Mexican Revolution. So, of course, like printmakers of that generation. But also just like the way that they make work in Mexico, I think is really influential to me. So I showed a couple pictures of the paper making that I've seen in Mexico. But also with printmaking, it's just so resourceful. It's like they might not have access to the same like Dick Blick, these big like art supplier companies that we have, but they're making it work and they're using really yeah, just like resourceful materials like the linoleum they're using for their lino cuts. It's not art linoleum with like fancy backing and stuff. It's just linoleum that you would use for your kitchen floor that they're buying at like, the equivalent of Home Depot down there and carving, and it works just as well. Or they're using umbrella spokes, like the metal pieces in an umbrella, they're using as etching needles or scribes instead of like fancy etching needles that we buy here for like 15 bucks. So I just love that kind of resourceful quality of Mexican printmaking. That's really, I think, exciting for me to see because it's like there's no excuse not to make the work that you want to make. And, I think as a printmaker, you have to have access to like a printing press, and we think we have to have these fancy materials, but they're making it work down there with what they have. So we can do the same up here.
So tell us a little bit about what's next for you. Do you have a body of work that you are leaning into or ideating on currently? Tell us what's next for you.
Yeah, so I'm definitely leaning into that work about my grandfather and his tile work. Paper making has become really exciting for me. I've been integrating it into my practice a lot more, and I see a lot of parallels with printmaking and paper making. So I think that's what's kind of fun about the piece that I have in the printmaking show sequence right now is a lot of them are integrating paper making and printmaking. And the one El Albañil, which I have right here, this is like predominantly paper making, but it's using a stenciling process. So in that way, I would argue that these are actually prints as well. So that's why it's kind of like a fun thing, like, trying to categorize our work and put them, we try to put them in these boxes of like, this is a print, this is a paper made piece, but it's all, you can blur the lines as much as you want. So yeah, I've been thinking a lot about paper making and how it can be used to make prints. And then with the context of the work or the content of the work being this tile making work. So thinking about my practice as an artist, my grandfather's practice as a tile worker, and those kind of like areas that they overlap. In this piece in particular, I was thinking about like the kind of hidden labor behind a lot of things like tile working and construction, and how there's like these long-standing buildings that we see, but we don't see the laborers or think about the people that spent time making them. So that's why he's kind of hidden in that thin set. And so that's another thing I'm kind of thinking about is like labor, and how that might tie in with my history and my familial history.
All right, so I think my last question for you would be, what advice would you give to someone starting their foray into printmaking and or social justice artwork? Anyone coming into the fray and exploring the arts, if you could go back and give yourself perhaps a piece of advice, what would that be?
Oh, that's a fun question. I think probably similar to the conversation of Mexican printmakers and how they're just like really resourceful. My advice would be to like a beginning printmaker not to get caught up in like the fancy equipment and tools and the expenses that come with printmaking. That again, printmaking and really all art forms, you can make it happen. Just like look around you at the materials that you have access to and um, yeah, just get started.
All right. Now, is there anything else that I didn't ask you that you want to make sure that you chat about your work or printmaking writ large before we sign off?
Maybe the only other thing I would say is that paper making is really exciting. And if you live in the Cleveland area, that you're lucky enough to have the Morgan Conservatory of Paper Making, which is like a world-renowned paper studio in Cleveland. So if you're interested in like, they also have printmaking there as well. They have a letterpress facility, but paper making is their kind of like larger thing. So if you're interested in getting started and you are a beginning artist, we have so many resources, including the Morgan in Northeast Ohio, that could also be really helpful on your journey.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Leigh, for the generosity of your time and talent. And thanks everyone for joining us for this artist talk by J. Leigh Garcia as a part of our programming series for Sequence. I'd like to give a special thank you to the curator, Christine DePiro Abbott, and a big thank you to all the other participating artists, as well as the Ohio Arts Council's board, the legislature, and the governor who support the Ohio Arts Council, this great space, and of course, Ohio artists. Thanks everyone and have a great day.